NATO is now facing a pivotal moment. President Donald Trump has returned to the White House and insisted that all NATO members allocate 5% of their GDP on defence spending. What's the reasons behind it? And what could it mean for the alliance's future? Let's find out.
We're protecting them, you know. They're not protecting us, we're protecting them. So I don't think we should be spending, I'm not sure we should be spending anything, but we should certainly be helping them. But they should up their 2% to 5%.
Now, Trump is very much an America first, and that's obviously been his slogan. And he feels that the United States is very much the spender in NATO, and it's time that Europe contributed more. So let's actually start looking at this. Now, within NATO, there's an acknowledgement that there is a need for increased spending, but this target of 5% seems to have come from nowhere and is a massive, massive step forward. Now, currently, nobody in NATO spends 5% of their GDP on defence. The US is the highest at 3.4%. Most countries are allocating about 2%, which is going to mean that for a lot of countries, it's more than doubling the defence budget. What's the options? Higher taxes, reduced social services, increased debt. Okay, now I can see the second one being something that Trump is not going to particularly worry about. Higher taxes, probably going to be politically unacceptable. Increased debt, probably again unrealistic. Now, to complicate things even further, looking at Trump's plan to increase, or rather to impose tariffs on the European Union, yeah, that's already causing tension. You know, we've got with Canada as well, and these potentially could strain the economies of those nations, making it even harder to increase the defence spending. Now, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has suggested using a checkbook strategy to counter potential tariffs, which includes purchasing American goods like gas and defence equipment. That's going to particularly complicate the financial landscape for Europe. But is that a possibility that is what Trump is trying for? Now, smaller NATO members will probably really struggle to get anywhere near the 5%. Somebody like, or small spenders rather, someone like Italy is going to have to more than triple its expenditure from 1.5%. Italy are pushing for the EU to relax the fiscal rules that allow increased military spending. So, under the system, the defence expenditures are then excluded from deficit calculations. Yeah, that's still under discussion, however, and generally the EU is quite resistant. They're financially, fiscally quite conservative. So that's not looking good. However, some members are starting to step up already. Lithuania and Estonia, they've become the first countries to commit to spending 5%. Both of these have a fairly good reason for this, if you think it through logically, being right on the Russian border. Sense that they will have that perceived interest in doing so. Now, during the Cold War, people were spending about 3.8% of their GDP on defence. And there was also a bit of a hidden bit of spending in that as equipment went out of date with the US, it trickled down to allies. We're not seeing that at the minute. And in fact, most surplus is either being scrapped or being shifted to the Ukraine, which is going to be another factor that's got to be considered. Does aid to the Ukraine come into that percentage? Yeah, it's another factor there. But after the Cold War, the peace dividends, yeah, they're going to take a long time to build back up. So let's think about some of the reasons that Trump may be doing it. One, perhaps cynical suggestion, is that it boosts US arms sales. We sort of touched on that earlier. If you want advanced weaponry, Europe is not going to be fast to deliver. And a lot of NATO allies may turn to America. Okay, that could then benefit the US defense industry. And US arms sales in 2024 did surge by 29% to 318.7 billion, mainly because people were replenishing stocks for the Ukraine. Yeah, that is a possible motive. Now, could it also be the fact that it's what he says? He actually does want to push NATO to support themselves, particularly against Russia. Yeah, that's a possibility. Now, could it be that it's actually to give him a way to reconsider US commitment to NATO? Well, the Allies aren't doing it, we shouldn't be part of NATO. That's going to play very well domestically in the US. Now, politically, there is something that people don't realise, that Article 5, an attack on one member, does not automatically result in other countries having to send troops. So he does have a get out there, but that's probably less politically acceptable. And it is rather ironic to note that the only country that has actually triggered Article 5 was the US after the 9/11 attacks. So we could have that being the reason. Now, what it may result in is Europe trying to have an independent defence strategy. Concept of the European army has been debated for years. There was the Franco-German brigade, which didn't do a lot. You've got things like the Ace Mobile Force, that is multinational. Could it gain momentum? Well, French President Emmanuel Macron is massively keen on it, as was the former German Chancellor Angela Merkel. And as recently as November, Luxembourg's Prime Minister, Luc Freeden, apologies for my pronunciation, was pushing for a European army, trying to move away from the concept of a NATO force. Now, that brings in an interesting point from the perspective of Britain, having left the European Union. If the force was under European Union command, that's slightly different to a European army. It brings other factors in politically, and it may be, for example, politically very difficult for the British to contribute to that. So they are possibilities. Now, something else to consider is the current situation in the Ukraine and Trump's relationship with Putin. So, in the last couple of days, Trump has announced the plan to initiate negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. Yeah, he said it was going to end within 24 hours of election. Okay. But could this be some factor in it, possibly a behind-the-scenes deal? I don't know. That has been again suggested, rather cynically. I genuinely am not sure where that one is going. But then let's consider what Russia might do if NATO does hit the target. So one of the things it might do, it will take time to build up. If they're going to do anything, the time to do it would be straight away. So any land grabs, things like that, would have to be done quickly. Do they have the capability to do that? Very difficult to identify, even from open source documents. Um, Again, treaty in the Ukraine might help with that. But there's also the non-NATO countries. Georgia or Moldova, they could easily be, shall we say, influenced. And it doesn't have to be overt Russian action. The Russians need to just claim persecution of a Russian minority and send in little green men. Who remembers that from the Ukraine back in the Crimea in 2014? It's deniable. And by the time it's either succeeded or failed, it's too late to do anything because it has thrown that confusion in. I recently played a Matrix game run by Dr. John Curry, which was absolutely fascinating. We were reacting to a Russian takeover of Zealand in Denmark. We were given very little background. It was a surprise move. We were trying to find out what had gone on. All we knew initially was that communication was down, and there was nothing, and we didn't know what was going on. Was it official? Could it be a rogue element? All of this, it gives you time to do stuff like that. So, a probably likely option, if NATO does start looking at it, is to enhance your deployment of troops near the NATO borders. With that, is that going to help, or won't it? Because could that actually then fuel the exact opposite of what the Russians want? That could give a big problem there. I probably Russian action is to start using diplomatic efforts to try and dissuade NATO. NATO's already quite split. There is a move to the far right, which is again threatening to split Europe, and leveraging economic or energy dependencies. Germany's already muttering about the possibility of starting to get energy back from Russia. That could start fracturing the alliance. And that's very much the way to do it, is to fracture it. Not to directly do stuff, but to start just putting those fault lines in. Information warfare. Yeah. Sowing discord. Yeah, we're sort of tying onto that. But rather than doing it through diplomatic means, to do it through public opinion. Get the information out on the ground. The Russians are very good at information warfare. There are bits that they don't really understand about the West, but that could be achieved. So that could be another one. And probably the most, I think, likely option would be hybrid, to use combinations of these. So Russia could be a factor that I've not heard mentioned yet. It's a difficult one, isn't it? We don't know how serious Trump is. We don't know how NATO will respond. We don't know how Russia will respond. So those are all factors to consider. But going even further, what about China? Now, removing America from NATO does suddenly make Asia another factor, because now an attack on the US, perhaps the bases in Japan, suddenly puts the US in a bit of an awkward position. They can't call automatically for that NATO help. Now, admittedly, Japan, Australia, and various other countries are increasing their spending on defence. But is that going to be enough? And there is no potential as yet for that formal alliance. There have been in the past. Maybe we'll see more bilateral treaties rather than the sort of the more formal NATO type ones. All in all, it's a very interesting time, and I use that in the Chinese sense of may you live in interesting times, which was a curse. I really hope that in the future I won't have to look back on this video and whimper. But let's see. Please throw your comments in the chat. I would be fascinated to hear your views.